to do and why we're trying to do it. So the first slide looks at equality. And in the NHS, we've always been very, very good at saying, well, we're an equal opportunities employer. We treat everybody the same. Well, if you treat everybody the same, you're going to get different outcomes because we're all coming from different places. So it's really important that people understand the difference between equality and equity. And what we're trying to do is to have an equitable service so that we put different systems and processes into place in order for people to have the right outcome, the same outcome. And that means with this agenda, that means that we do things differently in order to make sure that black and ethnic minority staff, who we know don't have the same access to all sorts of opportunities as their white colleagues, actually get to the same place. So this is why this slide is so important. And finally, what we hope is that ultimately there will be no barriers at all for anybody, regardless of who you are in the NHS. So I always show this slide, usually at the end of my presentation. But I think it's really important that we get that point about equity and equality. And Thomas Jefferson, who's in the panel, but he said there's nothing more unfair than the equal treatment of unequal people. And I think that that statement is really, really quite profound, and it encompasses everything that we're trying to do. Thank you. So, very, very quickly. This is Sir Andrew Cash, and some of you will know Sir Andrew Cash. He used to be the chief executive of one of the big foundation hospitals, one of the Shelford Group organisations actually. So there's 10 Shelford Group organisations, and they, between them, have billions and billions of pounds. They're the biggest organisations in our NHS. And he was actually chair of the Shelford Group for a little while. And I went and I spoke to the chief executives of the Shelford Group about the issues around race equality. And he said, Yvonne, this subject tangles me up in knots. I've never been somebody that has lots of black and ethnic minority people in my life, but actually my organisation has 15% of the workforce from black and ethnic minority backgrounds, and the population that we have in Sheffield is quite high, 18% or 19% of BME people. But nobody in my organisation from a BME background, and there's 20,000 people in the organisation above a band 7, not one. So he said, I need to do something about this, but I'm not quite sure what that something is. And that something was this, a piece of work that I did with Andrew in his organisation, looking at how we could move the dial on race equality in a big foundation hospital like that, with 6 sites. Now, if you can do it in an organisation like that, in the north, I think you can do that. You can do it anywhere. And so what we used was a system-wide approach. And I'll describe that a little bit later on in terms of what it is. But these puzzle pieces are the pieces of the approach. And the approach is evidence-based. I was very fortunate to go to Harvard in Boston. Dr. Williams, who is the world expert on health and race at Harvard University. He has done so much work on this. And what it shows is that there are 6 things that need to happen simultaneously in an organisation to move the dial on race equality. And that's what we did in Sheffield. But I actually found several things, personally for me, as I'm working back in an organisation, that need to happen in organisations to move the dial. And these are they. So one of the key things is actually having the chief executive and the chair and the rest of the board on board. Because if you haven't got that, you are never, ever going to move this agenda. And usually what people do is they actually delegate it down to the lowest common denominator and get somebody over there to fill in a box, and then they come and present it at the board, and nobody understands it and nobody knows it, and we all rubber stamp it and tick it off and say everything's okay. And with this agenda, you can't do that. You have to have senior leaders who understand this agenda, take it on board, and are very supportive of the work. So what I had in Sheffield was a chief executive alongside me, working with me on this agenda. And the two of us would go out and we would talk to members of staff. We talked to them about the importance of this agenda and what was going on in the organisation. Understanding the data, and in that organisation with 49 divisions, we drilled down into each of the divisions to know exactly what was going on in each of the divisions, and you won't be surprised to know that in some divisions it was actually absolutely fine and dandy and there wasn't a problem, and in other divisions it was really, really tricky and very difficult in terms of the data. And so we could actually focus on the areas that needed most help and support. So knowing the data is really important, and it helps us in the NHS because we love data and we love evidence. So we're an evidence-based organisation, and then you can know where you are and where you want to get to. It's very good to understand and know the data. The other thing that was really important for me in Sheffield and finding things out was about the comms strategy. I cannot stress to you how important comms is. Because if you do not get the communication right, you're going to get some serious pushback. Why then? Why is it that these BME people are getting better treatment than us? Why? You're going to get that a lot. So you have to be able to have a comms strategy that is supportive of the agenda and talk about the things that Jeremy and I talked about this morning, which is high quality patient care, patient safety, patient satisfaction, saving money. This is why we're doing this. We're not doing this because we want, Yvonne Coghill to be chief nurse or Habib to be chief medical officer or whatever. We want to make sure that all of our staff feel cared for, feel part of our organisation. And in order for our organisation to be the best organisation that it can be, we have to engage with all of our staff. That's why we're doing this for the BME staff in our organisations, because traditionally they haven't had that. That message has to be reiterated and reiterated, because you have to take all of your staff with you, or else you will get factions and it will be difficult. And I learned that at Sheffield in a very personal way. The other thing that's and all of these are important, but one of the ones that was really very important for me was black and ethnic minority staff not wanting me to be there. Some black and ethnic minority staff don't like this agenda. Aren't you surprised? I was. They don't like it. They think you're raising issues that aren't there. They think that you're causing trouble. They believe that it's not fair for their white counterparts. And I think that sometimes you have to be able to explain to them what it is and why it is you're doing what you're doing. Because most of them don't actually know the data. They don't know that there's nobody above a band 7 from a BME background in the organisation. They just make the assumption that it's all okay, that it's all fine and dandy. And I thought that was really, really interesting that several of them actually said, why are we doing this? It's not fair on our white colleagues. So lots of explanation and lots of comms, it's really important. And of course the other one is about white allies. And I cannot stress to you enough about the fact that you are so important in all of this. Because traditionally, people from white backgrounds don't talk about this because it's uncomfortable. And it's awful, and people usually say, well, I don't see colour, I'm just, I just like everybody, I have lots of black friends, and, that's not what we want. What we need for you is to acknowledge that there is an issue, and there's a problem here. And that's members of staff from the NHS, we all have to deal with it. It's not just Yvonne's problem or Habib's problem. It's all of our problem, because we all want the best for our patients. So in order for that to happen, we all have to take responsibility, and we all have to start talking about it. And when Yvonne and Habib talk about it, it doesn't have as much power as any of you in the room talking about it. It has so much power when white men talk about it. So much power, and white women. But really, if you hear your chief executive saying what he's saying, and other senior leaders like Simon Stevens and so on, people sit up and take notice. But Yvonne Coghill, she would say that, wouldn't she? She's a black woman, so she would say that. So it's really important that we get our white allies on board, because it's really, it's a complex and difficult subject matter. And in order for this to happen, we need everybody to put their shoulder to the wheel. And finally, I think, the last one, which is to expect it to be a marathon, not a sprint. We're on the road, and we've started, and we've got some, we've made some inroads, but don't expect it to change overnight. People say to me, well, Yvonne, you've been doing it for 3 years. Nothing's changed. Well, hello. This thing has been in the making for 400 years. We have to take time to unpick it, and we have to consistently do what we need to do in order to make things better for everyone. So prepare for some slowness. It is not a marathon, it's a sprint. And this slide just is one I'm particularly proud of in Sheffield. And I told you that Andrew and I was were going out and about and talking to people and so on and so forth. And what he was doing with me was we were going and seeing the band ones, the band twos, the people in hospitality, the gardeners, you know, people who he never ordinarily got to see in that organisation. And what we saw really quite quickly in the organisation was a change in engagement. And the fact that month on month we were making a saving in terms of people not going off sick. So the organisation wasn't having to pay for agency costs or bank costs, because the sickness levels, as Jeremy said this morning, were going down. And I think it's really important that people understand how much engaging with people can do. Because we all want to feel valued and appreciated and wanted and desired and all the rest of it. And if your chief executive comes into your kitchen or into your area, garden area, or wherever it is, and sits down and has a cup of tea with you and asks you, how is it for you around here? It makes you feel so much better about being in that organisation and recognising that you're of worth and of value and you're doing something great. And so when the absences started to go down and the money started to go up, other people in the organisation started to take notice as well. So this thing works, this nebulous thing called engagement, which costs us nothing in the NHS in a time when we haven't got any money. Thank you.
Great. So I'll be talking a little bit about what works and what doesn't work. We know from research, we know from evidence, and we know from our own intelligence of working on this and visiting trusts on a weekly basis that reducing managerial bias by just focusing on things like unconscious bias training on its own doesn't work in silo. It does have an impact when it's done and is implemented in relation to other interventions, but on its own, we know it doesn't work, and there's evidence to show that. We often get organisations hiding behind unconscious bias training, saying actually we're doing this, so we could tick the box and we don't have to do anything else on equality. But we know that on its own doesn't work for a number of reasons. One is that we know that there is also conscious bias, and secondly, even when you surface the unconscious bias and it becomes, when you surface the unconscious bias and it becomes conscious, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will do something about that, or that organisations will actually effectively act upon that, and it sometimes directs attention away from the deep-rooted issues, which are predominantly process and policy focused as well. So we know that that on its own doesn't work. Mentoring, reverse mentoring has an impact, a moderate impact. Research tells us that. But what has the most impact and what is the most effective are mandatory programs that have demonstrable leadership around them and are focused upon accountability and have data-driven accountability on them. And that's exactly the approach that we're taking with the WRES. So what we have in terms of the evidence-based approach are two facets. One is the operational interventions, things that you can put into place quite quickly in your organisations around recruitment, for example, having diverse interview panels, having a separate panel that shortlists and a separate panel that interviews for the same post to reduce any potential bias. Batch interviews rather than interviewing people on a singular basis has shown to have a positive impact. Looking at retention and progression, looking at things such as shadow boards, which some organisations are now focusing on and implementing with their own organisations. As Yvonne said this morning, it's not that BME people don't have the qualifications. They often have more qualifications than they need. It's a lack of opportunities and access to opportunities and experience that they often lack. So shadow boards is one intervention that can provide aspirant leaders with that kind of experience. And then disciplinary. We know this is a particular issue for organisations across the NHS, including some organisations in this geographical patch. What we find is that very often the disciplinaries occur because very often what we hear back is that white managers find it difficult to have that informal conversation with their BME staff, and they formalise something rather than having that conversation. So having a panel that reviews disciplinaries before they become formalised, and making sure that that panel is diverse and has an executive member on that panel, has shown to reduce disciplinary rates for BME staff. The Royal Free, for example, reduced theirs by 50% in 1 year by just having that informal process. But we know that alongside the operational interventions, you also need that cultural transformation as well, because it's all good having more BME people at senior levels, but if the organisation isn't ready for those people, then there's going to be an issue that we need to tackle. So exactly what Yvonne said, exactly what Professor Jeremy Dawson talked about this morning, having that compassionate learning culture within the organisation is absolutely critical for that. Mentoring and reverse mentoring are some of the interventions that can help create that. What we say is that these are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. So yes, focus on your operational interventions, and those operational interventions will shift your data, some of your RES data overnight. So one extra person on your board or one less BME person going through the disciplinary process will shift your RES data. But the data that will be difficult to shift are indicators 5, 6, 7 and 8 from the NHS staff survey, because those are the questions around discrimination, how it feels to be in an organisation. Those reflect the culture of the organisation, so we need to focus on both the operational stuff and the cultural transformation. Then we have what we had here were the enablers, the 6 enablers at the top, which are evidence-based and have come from Professor Williams from Harvard, and these are the 6. And as Yvonne said, you need to have all 6 in place at the same time. So very often you get organisations that say, actually, we're focusing on 2 or maybe even 3 of these, but it's all 6 simultaneously, and over a given period of time, that shift the dial on workforce race inequality. The most important of which is leadership and demonstrable leadership on this agenda. Those of you that have worked in equality will know that without that leadership, very often little gets done, or little has that system-wide impact that we want to see on this agenda. We also have metrics. We have the RES metrics, the RES data. Comms, as Yvonne said, is absolutely essential. Communicating this out to your staff, not just your BME staff, but the whole of the workforce. That goes back to the point around the interventions. Any interventions that are put in place need to benefit the whole of the workforce and not just one part of the workforce. So the disciplinary interventions, the interventions to do with recruitment or promotion need to benefit the whole of the workforce, and that needs to be communicated out, because it's about fostering good relations between groups, and it goes back to the Equality Act. Resources, role models, and something that we often don't do very often in the NHS is celebrating the success of our staff, and particularly our BME staff. So you need to have all of these things in place, pieces of the puzzle, in order to shift the dial on workforce race equality. And one organisation that has been doing that for a number of years now is North East London Foundation Trust. It's the only trust, I will come on to the data, it's the only trust that is showing greens against all of the 9 RES indicators. And not just in 1 year, but over a number of years. And one of the main reasons for that is the demonstrable leadership. So John Browder, who's the chief executive there, absolutely lives with values of the Constitution that Yvonne talked about this morning, in that he doesn't have an office, he hot desks with his staff, so he's accessible to his staff, just as Andrew Cash was in Sheffield talking to his staff. So people can approach the chief executive, have that informal conversation. He also tweets on a daily basis on race equality. He's probably the only chief executive, senior leader that I know, and probably you all know, that tweets on a regular basis on race equality and the importance of this agenda. He also attends new staff inductee meetings, and he doesn't just stay for the first hour or half the day, he stays for the whole of the day. And he's very open about how, as Yvonne said again, how what we've got in the NHS gives us exactly what we have. And it's been set up to give us that, and that white privilege, and he's open to talk about that white privilege. He also says that actually this organisation is a zero tolerance organisation around discrimination on any protected characteristic, including race, and if that's an issue with you as new staff coming into our organisation, then there's a door. I suggest this organisation isn't for you. And that message filters through the organisation. But it also filters through the local community as well. So these are some of the interventions that the organisation is putting into place, some of the things I've already mentioned around diverse interview panels, etc. But the most important thing, I think, is is a final point here, because I was working on the long-term plan recently, and somebody showed me data for the number of BME volunteers that work at this organisation, which were very high compared to any other organisation in the NHS. And they thought that was very odd. Maybe it's an extreme data anomaly. But I said, no, it probably isn't, because if you have a look at the RES data for this organisation, it's the best RES data in the whole of the NHS for a number of years. And what that means is that that organisation becomes a place where people want to work, even if they're not paid, and they want to be volunteers in that organisation. And in fact, with all the shortages of nursing that we have across the NHS, this is the organisation that Yvonne mentioned this morning that has a waiting list for nurses. They advertised for one nursing post earlier this year, and they had over 250 applications for this one post. So, as I said, that message filters through the organisation, but it also filters through the local community. So that organisation then becomes a place where people want to work. And this is a RES data for that organisation. As I said, it's been improving year on year, so it's that greens. It's got a couple of ambers. I mean, this amber here, indicator 4, is an amber that's going in the direction towards the BME staff. So BME staff are more likely to get non-mandatory training than white staff, so it's going in that direction. The reason why it's amber is because the aim of the RES is to close the gap. So there is equity, there's no difference. But for this one, there's a positive bias towards BME staff. They've got a good pipeline. I mean, there's more work to be done, even for this organisation, in terms of its board representation, but also in terms of the pipeline. But it's one of the few organisations where you have many more BME staff at the senior levels, bands 8 to 9, compared to other trusts. And it's this slide which I think is the most important slide, because what it shows is that North East London Foundation Trust, when you have a look at indicators 5, 6, 7 and 8, the more difficult ones to shift, their BME data for those indicators is better than the BME data for other organisations in its geographical patch. But if you look closely, their data for white staff is better than the data for white staff in other organisations as well. So what that tells us that by focusing on workforce race equality and on the RES, they're making a positive impact for the whole of the workforce and not just one part of the workforce. And of course that goes back to Yvonne's point that she made this morning, which was taken from Jeremy Dawson's report, that the way that you treat your BME staff is a good barometer for the overall culture of the organisation. It has a positive impact for the whole of the workforce. So we've got a task now. We've got about 25 minutes left. We've got data here for this patch, geographical patch, which we want to share with you that you can have a look at. And we would want you to have a look at sort of 3 kind of questions. What is the data telling you? Why is it telling you that? And what is it that we can do to improve on that data? I'll just hand out. Yeah. What we do is we put up the definitions of the moment indicators.
So you've got the definitions of the indicators up on the board, so you don't need to remember what they are. So that's great. So before we start, people, hello. Are there any questions that anybody wants to ask us before we kick off with the workshopping and you guys discussing why you think the data is as it is and what you're going to do about it? Questions? There's one gentleman that doesn't have here.
What are indicator 5, 6, 7 and 8 again?
Ta-da! And there's another hand.
It's not related to the data, but I was interested what you said about shadow boards and what that is.
Yeah, so shadow boards is basically you have sort of the aspirant leaders of your organisation, so maybe bands 9, bands 8D, that can form a shadow board. So the shadow board meets on the day before the actual board meets, and it goes through the same board papers, and it makes recommendations to the board. What that does, it offers opportunities to perhaps your BME staff or staff that are underrepresented, because we know that BME staff often have more qualifications. There's a lack of experience and lack of access to experience that they really need to focus on. So some organisations such as South West Yorkshire Partnership Trust have that, and they've got good YouTube videos, only 25 minutes, but they're very good.
Just put shadow board.
Yeah, NHS shadow boards, and it explains exactly what it is and how it works and the benefits of it.
Okay, so there are 3 questions. What does the data say to you? Why do you think the data is as it is? And what are you going to do about it? So what we want you to do is have conversations on your table, have a look at the data, and see what you think. I mean, there's not going to be a lot of time for feedback, but we'll try and see whether we can squeeze at least 5 minutes feedback in. But more importantly, is this is the data for your patch. And what we want, don't look at this bit here, this is SNEL. This is just telling you what the definitions are. And what we want you to do is to actually get a sense of what's going on in your... My husband's a teacher. Are you guys got it? Are you guys okay? I don't know if we could put these in focus here. Should we read them to you? Are you alright? Can you see them? No. Okay, so indicator 2, yes, is the relative likelihood of white staff being appointed from shortlisting compared to BME staff. That's indicator 2. Indicator 3 is the relative likelihood of BME staff entering the formal disciplinary process compared to white staff.
Sorry. Would you be able to just tell us what's good for each one? So for the first one, is it 1.0 would be the best?
1. So for these, yes, these workforce indicators, we're looking at 1. As Habib said, we want it to be the same for BME staff and white staff. We don't want BME staff to be disadvantaged, we don't want white staff to be disadvantaged. So we're looking at the number 1. So anything above the number 1 is quite high, and I think you'll find that there's some that are way above the number 1. You can see from NELF, back in 2016, you were 3 times more likely to be disciplined if you were from a BME background than if you were from a white background. 2 times more likely. You were 3 times more likely to be appointed if you were a white member of staff than if you were from a black and ethnic minority background. And they've consistently brought that down so that it becomes fairer. That's what we're looking at. This one, indicator 4, which is the relative likelihood of white staff accessing non-mandatory training, what has happened is that they're overperforming, they're going the other way. They're training and developing and sending more BME staff off on non-mandatory training. And with that indicator, which we don't particularly like, it's not a good one, because people can't collect the data very well and it's not very robust, that seems to be happening a lot. People seem to be sending people off on non-mandatory training, or at least that's what the data say. And it appears that BME staff are being sent off on non-mandatory training much more than their white counterparts, because that's what that means. It's not 1. It's gone below the 1. And then, of course, there's indicator 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are staff survey indicators, which you've probably seen before, and they're on bullying and harassment. Indicator 5, bullying and harassment by patients, relatives, and the public. Indicator 6, percentage of staff experiencing bullying and harassment from other staff, so colleagues. Indicator 7, which is about equal opportunities and progression, what they think about their organisation. And indicator 8, which is bullying and harassment from senior leaders, managers, and so on. And I've been told that those 2 indicators are the most robust. You can tell a lot from an organisation from indicator 7 and indicator 8. And of course, indicator 9 is the percentage of BME board membership. So what we want you to do is to have a look at the data and tell us what you think is going on in your region, in your patch, with your providers. Okay. Really? Yeah.
pointed the right question. So let's find out more likely to be
the difference in that group, so great. If you compare us to the community trusts, we're about average. I think we're bang on average. Community trusts, we don't have a large medical workforce. The doctors and the dentists are the ones with the more diverse. We don't have a large community, we're large middle class females. That's what they are. We really see the jobs you get out
so they're still almost as sick. So you can still almost double. Yes, still almost double everyone else. Everyone else is AI at last.
their numbers are huge.
Their numbers are huge.
I don't think there's answers to it. I can't look at the picture. But that puts a bias in your mind, doesn't it? Even if you don't want it to. For the majority.
Also, all of these answers.
The sad thing is, different to age, is your more senior members, so it's your manager team. Whereas 5 and 6 are public and staff. So actually people are finding it's worse when they're senior.
Empty the box and get people to and we need to organise and sort it. And you time
Well, I suppose the question is how do
And we've got really strong co-chairs. We've got our deputy medical director of the
I think that's
something like this might be and
A few minutes left.
That's right.
Any particular patterns that you've seen in the data that you want to highlight? Any particular issues or anything that comes to mind that you had a look at?
So there were some that stood out that maybe weren't as good as others. However, we felt that we wanted to drill down even further to say where might that be? Is that a particular team, directorate, whatever? So yeah, that's good.
And that's exactly what they did at Sheffield, because their rates of disciplinaries weren't great. But when they did the deep dive into where are those disciplinaries in terms of the directorates, they were able to identify which directorate and then focus on that directorate to get the overall score better. So the deep dives are very good.
I know I'm biased because this is one of my trusts here. So, I think it is about the interpretation. So we as a community trust don't do as well as some of our acute trusts, but our medical workforce is tiny compared to the acute trust, and the medical workforce is way more diverse than the nursing workforce. We do the drill down, we report on metric 2 every single quarter to board. We've done it for 3, and actually what we found was just measuring it brought it down. Our approach around race equality, I'll just show you, I'll be very brief with it, but we created our staff network, which again 120 sites of a massive geography, it wasn't easy, but very much appreciated bringing our BME staff together. They were very angry when we first started meeting. What we heard was they had every right to be angry. And so we are just about to conclude our workplace inquiry into racism. We have to go through this process of reflection and introspection. The board have been very on board with it. We've got to go through this process because actually we can't necessarily address some of the great stuff without kind of acknowledging some of the stuff that wasn't so great that's gone before. The reason why I'm sharing that is because when we do drill down the data, because we do that drilling, we find, say, recruitment is particularly bad in our children's services, where white staff are about 3 times as likely. Whereas in kind of central Crawley area, it's the other way around. It kind of flips, And then we have to think about things like, so largely let's think about children's services. Well, things like our health visitors. Okay, so what is it about health visiting in Sussex, which and what is about health visiting full stop? Which actually we're not getting the right kind of pipeline of talent. So this is why it has to be a system-wide conversation. We have a lot of discussions about the fact that you can be a BME member of staff working for my trust and earn less than a BME member of staff doing exactly the same job on the same site because SASH have their headquarters in East Surrey, so qualify for London waiting. So we have real issues around that particular issue and being an attractive employer. So I've always encouraged you to go behind the data, look at the trended data. This is just 1 year's. Actually, ours have improved, have come down and down in a positive fashion. We're still not great, but also think about benchmarking against the appropriate organisation. This is looking at it regionally. Yes. When I benchmark, I look at it against other community trusts, because otherwise it's not the these packages and the oranges and edges. I'm sorry.
Maybe that's very good. We probably want to capture some of that good practice. I'll probably share that around this patch as well as to what works. Any other observations?
I think it was a bit sort of at times disheartening to think there wasn't really any shining beacons necessarily straight away to think, oh, okay, there's one particular trust that's doing particularly well in our patch. There were some indicators where a trust would do particularly well on that, but then not so well across the others. And I think we tried to maybe play a little game of connecting them all and coming up with a theory of why it might be, but without understanding the narrative, the trends, the data, what goes behind it. It's quite difficult to do that. And I think also why it's difficult and why you might say, okay, one trust has a particularly bad disciplinary rate, but yet they don't seem to have a problem with manager, people having conflict with their senior managers. So without understanding how that is communicated as a strategy or a comms plan or the culture within that organisation and the thread that ties the front line right to the top and the commitment and buy-in, it's very difficult then to understand where the issue is and where to go with it.
And the other point to keep in mind is the fact that the NHS staff survey questions and data, there's a time lag, so it's 1 year behind the other data that we get. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So there's a time lag, and the data the data we get back, the timing of the publication.
And to the lady's point, it's really, really important to drill down into the data, because just looking at it, and this is what happens at most boards, they look at it and say, oh, that looks okay, rubber stamp, thank you very much, off you go, and not fully understand what's going on in their organisations. In Andrew's Trust, we drilled down into every single one of the 41 or 42 directorates to see exactly what was going on, and it was really interesting because what we found was there was a type of leader that meant that you had higher disciplinaries, and guess what? They were younger people. The older leaders in the organisation were much more relaxed about things than the younger leaders, which was interesting. So there was a training and development need in the organisation which was put into place. So understanding what's going on and what the data's saying to you is the first step. It's really, really key.
Right. Okay, so we looked at 2 and 3. I'm briefly aware of time. So 3 was quite interesting. So we think number 3 potentially related to a fear factor in sort of management, and a fear that particularly specific staff may have the race card. So we're going to that's what we believe is coming from number 3. So a manager will perhaps have that informal conversation with a white member of staff, will be a bit afraid of that. The BMA, so go down a formal route when it might not be necessary. So we think that's behind some.
We hear that a lot actually when we go out and speak at trusts and
on number 2, we think there's quite a bit of, should we say, sort of arranged recruitment that goes on within the NHS. It's a bit of a weird turn-up with HR sitting next to me. So you kind of get your mates on the panel, because like Lola said, she was amazed when Lola came to Sussex. She was amazed how many of us have worked together before across the patch in Sussex. So we've all moved between organisations, we've all worked together. So you kind of get your pals on your panel, even if they're not your same team, to cover a box for you. But you've already lined up who it is before the interview. And of course, if you've got a BME ratio issue now, you're just making it worse by continuing that behaviour.
So we're conscious of time. Byron's here. So these are the kind of conversations that we encourage you to have in your own organisation as well as with your providers as well. But it was very short. We're aware that it's very short, but we will usually have a longer period of time to go through the data and discuss it in more depth. Thank you.